Hey Defenders, welcome back. In this video, I want to show you guys how we can hunt for malicious DNS queries that are made from our Windows endpoints. So ultimately what this will allow us to do is to detect when one of our Windows servers has requested to resolve a DNS name. So that could be like hacker.com, for example. By combining Wazuh, Alien Vault, and in a domain stat service that will be able to detect when a new query has been made within our infrastructure, and then analyzing that domain reputation by making an API call out to Alien Vault to see if there has been malicious activity associated with this domain. So this allows us to hunt in real time for malicious DNS queries that are made by our Windows endpoints. There are a few prereqs and requirements that are needed. So for example, Sysmon needs to be installed and configured on our Windows endpoint. If you're unfamiliar with Sysmon, I'll link to a video that we previously covered in the top right, and as well as within the description of this video. We'll need PowerShell version 7, so we'll go through that install process as well on our Windows endpoint, which is pretty easy to enable. And then we'll need to create an ATX Alien Vault user so that we can make API requests out to Alien Vault to get the reputation around our query domain. So a little bit of just a little basic diagram of kind of the flow of data throughout this process. So we first have our Windows endpoint that is running Sysmon. Sysmon, as you know, we have a specific event ID that are specifically for DNS queries. So when I try to connect to opensecure.co, our Windows endpoint will make a DNS query out to its name server to resolve that IP address so it knows where to send the traffic. And so what we're going to do is gathering these DNS queries, sending them to our Wazuh manager, and then our Wazuh manager is going to make a call out to our domain stats server. And basically what it's going to ask is, hey, have we seen this domain before? If the domain stats server comes back with a low frequency score, or if this is a new domain that is being queried within our environment, we'll then make the Wazuh manager will then make an API call out to Alien Vault's API and say, hey, is this malicious? And then depending on the response that we get back, we'll trigger a Wazuh alert or not. So it's a really powerful way for us to actively hunt for malicious DNS queries being made by our Windows endpoints. I do first want to give a quick shout out to a fellow defender named Juan. I'll link to his GitHub, which is what I'll follow throughout this video down in the description below, and is a really good example of how we can build upon open source tools by bringing in other integrations into our Wazuh stack relatively easily. So big shout out to Juan, and y'all make sure and check out his GitHub. But let's go ahead and jump into it. And all right, so first things first, let's go ahead and spin up our domain stats server. So if you go into Juan's GitHub here, he links to the domain stats repo. So you can just follow this link here, and we'll go ahead and install domain stats. It's pretty easy to install. You can, of course, install it on a server, on a dedicated server, but in this demo, I'm just going to deploy it on our Wazuh manager here. And it's pretty easy to install. It does require Python 3, so that's really the only dependency that we need here. And let's go ahead and jump onto this. So if I do, so I'll cd into my auth, and we'll run a git clone of our domain stats. And I already have that file, so I get the error here. If we list this out, we'll then run a Python 3, and then we'll call pip install via Python 3. So we'll go ahead and run this, and then this will install all the dependencies that are needed to make this to work. And then so once that's installed, we are pretty good to go here. The first thing, what we need to do prior, is to create our directory where all of our data will be stored. So domain stats will store our DNS queries that are made within this directory. So I'll go ahead and make this directory just called my data. This of course can be any name you want, so now we need to run this domain stat settings, and then we're going to tell domain stat settings, hey, the directory that I want you to hold the data in will be this my data directory. So if we go ahead and run that, we'll have a few configuration settings that it'll ask us to make. So first it's asking for the IP address. I'm just going to have this listen on the local host, so I'll just say 0.0.0. It's asking for a port. By default, this is 5730. I'll just leave it as the default there. Of course, you can change that however you seem fit. And then you can set some values for workers and for some threads. I'm just going to leave these all at the default. You can make some time zone changes. I'll leave that to default. We'll pretty much just default everything through. And then it'll ask you eventually to commit changes to disk. And we'll just do a capital Y to say yes. And now the configuration has been written. And now all that we need to do is run a domain stat. And then again, we specify the directory where our data is held. And this will be my data. So we see this spin up and working, and then if I bring out another session, you can also run it as a service. He details that a little further down in his GitHub, but we'll go ahead and just open a new terminal. And if I run netstat, we'll be able to see that we are listening for connections on 5730, and we see Python 3 is what's running under the hood. And so a little bit what we can do is I can actually access this via a web browser. So if we go into our web browser here, and it will be HTTP by default, and I'll go to 5730, and here you can see it not found. But what it'll do is if we actually do a slash and then any domain, so let's say google.com, we'll get a JSON output back. So here you can see when we include our domain, right, we see alert, we see your first contact, right? So this is domain stat saying, hey, this is the first time we've seen this DNS query being made on your network. And that involves this guy here. But still what we need to do is we need to set up our Wazuh manager to be able to make requests out to this guy. And if we go back into Juan's GitHub here and scroll down a little bit, we'll see our custom integration that we can set that will make the call out to domain stats. So what Wazuh would receive back via domain stats would be this JSON block here stating, hey, this is your first contact. Last time it was seen within the environment, and we'll then be able to take that to then make the API query out to Alien Vault. So if we jump onto our Wazuh manager here, we need to configure a custom integration. So if I cd into var osec integrations and list this out, you'll see some of our previous custom integrations done, but we'll need to first create our custom DNS stats, and I'm copying the same names that Juan specified in his repo. So DNS stats, and we will copy this block here, which is just our wrapper, essentially our Python wrapper, and paste that there. And then we'll do the same for a custom DNS stats.py, which will be our Python script. So, and then if we scroll down, you'll see he has the custom DNSstats.py. So if we copy this block here, and we'll paste it into here. The only change we'll need to make, though, is to make sure our base URL is pointed to the server that is actually running this. So I just set it to 0.0.0. To the server that is running domain stats, right? So Wazuh will now make the request out to this specific host here. So if you're installing this on the same box that's running the Wazuh manager, you can just make it the local host. Or if it's a remote dedicated server that you have running domain stats, you'll just put the IP address there and then whatever port you assign there. So that's all the changes we need to make to that script. We will now need to change the ownership of this file to root and OSEC so that the Wazuh manager can correctly has access to read these files. and we so if we run at ls, we see that the root and OSEC group are configured for these two files, and we need to modify these files to 750. We'll say custom DNS stats and a wildcard there, and if we ls this out, we see ownership and execution permissions are set appropriately. So that looks good. Now, before we restart our manager to apply these rules, we need to, within the osec.conf, include this integration block that'll say, hey, every time you see a DNS query, again, this will relate to our sysmon event number 22, which will be more clear in a second. That's when I want you to trigger this integration script to reach out to the domain stats server and ask, hey, have we seen this DNS query before? So if we copy this block here and then we navigate into our osec.conf file, scroll down here, I'll just scroll down to where I have my integrations. And here you see I've already pasted this in. But so what we're doing is we're calling our custom DNS stats, and this points to your wrapper. So notice we don't have the .py extension here. That's because our wrapper will call it. And then here, instead of group, so Juan just put group sysmon event underscore 22. However, I am hard specifying it to my rule ID that I see within my Wazuh manager, right? So if I go into our Wazuh manager, and if I filter on this particular rule here, this will pertain to DNS queries that we receive via our sysmon logs. So if I paste that, if I filter on that particular rule ID, here you'll see sysmon event 22 DNS query, and if I scroll down, we see the domain that was queried for. So if you have a different, and again, this pertains to the Wazuh rule ID, right? So if you have a different rule ID number, which you probably will, you'll just want to make sure that your correct rule ID is set there so that anytime Wazuh sees this rule ID come in, it knows to trigger this script that makes the call out to domain stats. So you'll save that. You can, of course, also use a group block if you have your rules grouped differently. You just need to reflect that here and make sure that that's correct there. So if you save that off, and then we'll need to restart our Wazuh manager. And then while that's restarting, let's go ahead and jump onto our Windows agent and install PowerShell version 7, right? Because that is a prereq for this, and we'll also need to include some scripts onto here as well. So I've already installed sysmon. Again, there's a link to that video in the description below, and I have also installed PowerShell version 7. But if you just do a Google search for install PowerShell version 7 here, you'll see that you can just grab this MSI package. You can just select this guy and run it, and that'll install PowerShell version 7 for you that is needed for this. So that's also very easy to install there. And then once that is installed, we'll need to put some active response scripts on our endpoints themselves so that we'll be able to make the call out to Alien Vault and say, hey, is this DNS query malicious or not? And now let's add the PowerShell script here that we'll put onto our Windows agent, right? Our Windows endpoint here, to make the call out to Alien Vault. So if we copy this block of code here, so if we open up Notepad here, and I will paste the contents of this script here. However, we do need to make a change. We need to upload our API key so that Alien Vault accepts our request, right? And this is a free key to obtain. You do have to register. If you go to otx.alienvault.com, you'll see you can sign up to be able to interact with their Open Threat Intelligence API. So you'll have to make sure you sign up for that. But after signing up, you'll be redirected into your console here that you have. Here you can see I've logged in, and then I have my OTX key off to the side. So I can just copy this guy, and I will paste it within the block here. And then that's the only change we need to make. We will need to make sure we, of course, save it as a PowerShell script and not a text file. And I'll follow the naming convention that Juan has used, which is just otx.ps1. So I'll paste that in there. And I'll change this to just all files. And I will save that off. Now let's add the command that the Wazuh manager will tell our Wazuh agent to run via active response, right? So we've created the PowerShell script, but now we need to make to create the file that calls PowerShell 7. As it says PowerShell 7, let's run this OTX PowerShell script, which is what we just created here below. So if we copy this block off, I will just exit out of this and I'll open Notepad again and paste that in there. However, my directory is not the same, right? So I'll go however, my directory where I have this PowerShell script is not the same. So I'll just erase this value here. And I stuck this, I think, under C downloads. Yeah. And I'll just grab the location of this guy and paste that here and do a slash. Okay, good. And let's now save this as, let's save this. Okay, so now we need to save it. And where we need to save it is in the active response folder so that the Wazuh manager can call this script via our Wazuh agent. So if we go into C, it'll be under program files, x86. We go into OSEC agent, go into active response, and then go into our binaries folders here. Now let's save this. And here you'll see the other active response scripts that come pre-installed with Wazuh. However, we've created our own. So we now need to save that as such. And it should be saved as otx.cmd. So we copy this guy, paste it there, and we'll go ahead and save. Alright, so now if we navigate into this guy, we should be able to run this script. Of course, nothing's going to happen, but it's not erroring out or anything on start, so that's a good sign. And if we press any key, it should probably error out, and it does, but that's fine. We know that the script is able to be called via our we know that our PowerShell script is able to be called via our Windows command script that we have here. Now let's tell our Wazuh manager to run this script on the Wazuh agent. So the Wazuh manager can take advantage of the active response feature to remotely trigger events on our Wazuh agents. And that's what we're going to do with this block here. So if we jump back onto our manager, again, navigate into our osec.conf file, we will paste that block within here, right? So we're going to we're just going to name it. It'll just be this Alien Vault OTX. And here you can see that the executable is the otx.cmd, right? Which is what we just created on our Wazuh manager here, right? By default, you don't Wazuh already looks in the localhost program files, OSEC agent, active response bin directory, so you don't need to specify the full path here. You can just say the name of the executable. However, if you named it anything differently, that'll need to reflect here. And then we have our location set to local, so this is saying that we want this script to run on any agent that we see this request from, that we see a DNS query from. And then here we specify our rule groups, which is our DNS stat alert. So let's go ahead and now create these custom rules that will belong to this particular rule group. So anytime a rule triggers within this particular rule group, it'll run this script, which will call out to Alien Vault and get the response back. So if we save that, and then if we scroll up, we need to create our custom rules. And here you can see that here. So if I go into our, we go into our local rules here, cd into rules, and you see we have our local rules.xml file. And here we have the code block that will handle this. So what this is going to do is whatever response we get back from our DNS stats, or from our domain stats. So for example, right, we asked domain stats, hey, google.com. We fed it that domain, and it responded back to us, your first contact. Well, we need a way for the Wazuh manager to be able to read that JSON response back and then build a rule on that. And so that's exactly what this rule ID here is doing. So here you can see we're looking for the field name, dnsstats.alerts, and we're looking for the field to be your first contact. And this will become a little more clear when we actually manually run this. But what we're saying is, hey, if you see the text, your first contact within this field, we know that, hey, this domain was queried for the first time. So we can also get a reply back from domain stats being a low frequency score or a suspected frequency score. So as you can see here, it has another block called frequency score. And I'm not totally sure how this number is calculated, to be honest. There may be more details on it within the domain stats GitHub, so it may be worth looking there. Or we can also get a new field back to where, hey, RDAP, which is what DNS stats is using under the hood, can say, hey, this DNS query was recently spun up, right? So say I published opensecure.co yesterday, and all of a sudden a endpoint makes a DNS query out to opensecure.co. Our domain stat server would tell us, hey, this DNS was made to a domain that was recently created, right? So this is a good way to tell if a lot of attackers cycle through domain names really quickly, right? Because they want to try to evade malicious DNS reputations, right? So a tactic to get around that is just spin up as many domains as you can. This would tell us here, hey, this domain name was recently created and could be suspicious as well. So you can just copy this block here, and then you'll paste it in here. I've already done that. Another thing to note here, if we scroll down to where we just configured our active response capabilities, you see that we only want this to trigger on the rules group DNSStat_alert. Well, all of these rules are assigned to that particular group, and so that's what this block is specifying here. So now anytime any of these rules trigger, the Wazuh manager will run this active response capability, right? So that's where this config block comes into play there. So we can go ahead and save this off. And I believe we can now restart our manager and restart our agent, and we should be good to go. So let me go ahead and restart our Wazuh manager, and then let me jump on the agent and restart this guy as well once our manager comes back. Let me go ahead and navigate back into here. There is a Wazuh web UI, this Win32 UI, that if you right click this and select run as administrator, you'll get a little GUI to pop up that gives you the status of your Wazuh agent. So our manager has restarted, and now we can just go ahead and restart our agent, and this will restart our agent for us. And here you can see now it's running. So that looks good. So now let's go ahead and trigger some DNS queries. And go into Microsoft, Windows, and we'll grab our Sysmon events. So if we scroll down here into Sysmon and select operational, we'll see our Sysmon events here. So if we for example, if we make a DNS query, let's just say I'll just ping opensecure.co. It resolves it, and then if we refresh our Sysmon logs, here we'll see a DNS query was made to opensecure.co, right? And so now, because we've configured our Wazuh agent to send Sysmon logs to our Wazuh manager, we'll also see that within our web UI here. So I'm already filtered on this particular rule. So if I refresh this guy, we will see our DNS query made out to opensecure.co. Right? So now from here, right? So now let's go ahead and let me unfilter on this rule. And let's see if we can trigger off a malicious domain. So if I just make a DNS query, let's say I want to ping this dogfunnyvideos.xyz, right? I personally have a cat, but dogs are always cool too. So I'll ping this guy. We will see, of course, if we refresh this guy, we'll see our DNS query being made out to this 83 dogfunnyvideos.xyz. If we go back into Wazuh, so now the Wazuh manager is receiving this log, right? And it's saying, hey, let's take this DNS query and now let's ask domain stats if it's seen it before. So if we come into our web UI, if I refresh this guy, we'll now see the workflow kind of start to take place, right? So our Wazuh agent first sends us our sysmon logs, right, for event 22. So we see so here we see the DNS name that we were querying, right? And so then immediately after that, we see our Wazuh manager make the call out to our domain stat server, right? And that gets its response back here. So we see, so because first what happens is we want to see, hey, is this DNS name been queried in the past? And here you can see it is a low frequency score, and this is our first contact. So if we actually copy this value and then paste it into this guy, we will see the same output, right? So we see the alert of low frequency score being sent back to our Wazuh manager, and this rule that we have configured here detects when we see the string low frequency score, and we've created this rule description, say, hey, this is a low frequency score and a query domain. And because this rule ID is part of our DNS stat alert, we're going to go ahead and trigger the active response on the agent that makes the call out to Alien Vault and says, hey, is this malicious or not, right? So if we scroll up a little bit, we then see our DNS query being made out to Alien Vault, right? So our flow is working accordingly, right? So now the agent is going out to Alien Vault and is making the API request with the domain, our dog funny videos. We then get our response back from Alien Vault saying, hey, there's an indicator found. So if we scroll down here, if we expand this guy, we see that Alien Vault has responded that it has some indicators of compromise around this particular domain. So if we actually go into Alien Vault and just paste this domain within our search query, we see 3 exploit kits that this domain has been a part of, right? That this domain has been seen having a relationship with. And here we see the root level domain, right? So we DNS queried for a subdomain of .80 a subdomain of 83.dogfunnyvideos.xyz, but here Alien Vault is flagging on the root domain, which is really cool. And all right, let's run through this process again, because it is a lot of integration of some different tools. So let's run through this process and workflow again so we can kind of fully wrap our heads around it. So first, let's find a malicious domain. I found this zzhreceive.top, which within Alien Vault's Open Threat Exchange, they have marked this as suspicious and malicious. A lot of S's there. So if let's just copy this domain name here. I'll go back onto my Windows endpoint and I'll just ping out to this domain. So if we ping out, looks like the host is up. So regardless if the host is up or not, a DNS query is still made. So if we go ahead and refresh this guy, we will see our DNS query out to oracle.zhreceive.top, right? And so then if we go back into our Wazuh dashboard and refresh here, we'll see the workflow start to kick off. So we first get our DNS query. Sorry, my computer froze there for a sec. We first get our DNS query out. We first get our sysmon event saying, hey, we see a new DNS query. And we see that out to our domain that we just queried for here. We then get our response back from domain stat saying, hey, this DNS query is a recently created domain, right? So that's interesting. This is a brand new domain that has recently been registered. And if you want to kind of see how that's working from the domain stat side, if we just copy our domain and then paste it within here, we see we get the same thing back. So we see that domain stats is saying, hey, this category is new. And so this is the JSON that our Wazuh manager is reading, and then that's what this rule is built off of. So domain stats is telling our Wazuh manager, hey, this domain name has recently been created. So the Wazuh manager says, okay, let's take that, and now let's run our analysis on Alien Vault. So it sends the active response command to the Windows Wazuh agent and says, hey, let's take that domain name and make an API request out to Alien Vault. And of course, since Alien Vault is marking this domain as suspicious, we know that we should get a positive hit back. And sure enough, the next alert that we get back is, hey, Alien Vault has found a indicator of compromise that is established to this domain name. So now we know that our Windows endpoint has made a DNS resolution request for a no malicious domain, right? And that's a good indicator of, hey, so, something on that box, whether it be software or human related, has tried to resolve this malicious domain. Is a really good indicator that, hey, this box is infected. Or you have a malicious user on this box who is trying to reach out to this specific domain. And so again, coming back to it, there are a few key pieces of technology in play. Of course, we have our Wazuh Windows agent and our Wazuh manager, which you guys should be pretty familiar with already. We then have our domain stat server, which is where we get our response back to, hey, is this domain been newly created? Is this a new domain that is asking to be resolved? Is this the first time on the network that we've seen that? And if so, let's go ahead and make the API request out to Alien Vault and say, hey, is this domain a known indicator of compromise? And if it is, we get our alert back saying, hey, Alien Vault has seen this domain as part of a indicator of compromise. And then you can, of course, copy and paste that domain name just up top here, and you can see some other metadata, this particular malware. So we see, other subdomains of this root level domain here. We see some URLs associated with this malicious domain, and then some other domains that are related to this actually. So then we could go out and see, hey, have there been other DNS queries made out to these other related domains? But we've now been able to automate most of this process for us, right? So from here on out, any DNS queries made by our Windows endpoints will go through this same cycle. And all that is automated for us. And now what we can then send out to our InfoSec team and generate, high severity alerts around of is, hey, if we get a response back from Alien Vault saying an indicator is found, okay, now we know we need to take some action. So this is a really good example. And again, shout out to Juan. This is a great integration that he put together, and is a great example of how we can take our open source tools and integrate them with other services, such as Alien Vault and other open source tools such as domain stats. So I hope I've done a decent job kind of explaining this workflow. Again, as always, please reach out in the comments or on our Discord if you have any questions, concerns, or any issues. And I appreciate you guys hanging out with me, and I will see you in the next one.